Welcome, welcome, precious gospel kindred. We are happy you to meet and make you freely welcome.
Greetings from the Enfield Shaker Museum. My name is Michael O'Connor, and I'd like to welcome you to the second presentation in our 5-part series looking at the material culture of the Enfield Shakers and highlighting objects from our collection. Today's topic is cooperage. What exactly is cooperage? In essence, cooperage is wooden containers made of individual staves held together by hoops. So the staves make up the sides of the container. In the traditional process, which was used in the early 19th century, each individual stave is first carved or backed with a backing knife to put the outside curve on it. It is then hollowed with a hollowing knife to put the inside curve on the stave. Both those processes take place at the shaving horse, the bench and vise that I'm sitting at here. The stave is then joined over a Cooper's long joiner, and the joint on the edge of the stave has two components. The first is called shot. It's the angle in relation to the curve of the outside container. The second component is pitch, and that's the taper from wide to narrow that's given to each individual stave. This joinery allows the staves to meet up to its next stave and create a joint tight enough to fulfill the needs of whatever the container is made for. That's the staves. The ends of coopered containers are called heads. So a bucket like this has a single head, whereas a little belly-shaped container like this keg has two heads. And finally, it's the hoops that hold it all together. Hoops can be made out of wood, like these sapling hoops on this little keg, or metal, as you can see on this bucket that I'm working on. Iron is the most common, although we will see one brass hoop container as we look at some containers today from the Enfield Shaker Village. So the material selected, or the wood selected for any given container, will be determined by its end use. The objects we will see today are all straight-sided containers. That category of work is called white work, and for that, pine would be a very commonly chosen wood. It's light, easy to carve, relatively abundant, and is tight enough to do the job, so it is watertight. So that's a little bit about the containers. Let's take a quick look at the trade of coopering in the 19th century. It enters the century as a fully apprenticed trade. So a young man would be indentured to a master for a period of not usually less than 7 years. It's a relatively long apprentice. And he'd learn every aspect of making a container from beginning to end by the hand process, which you see here. Over the course of the 19th century, that process will be mechanized. By the end of the century, it's a fully mechanized industrial process. And interesting, the Enfield Shakers will parallel that change. They start out by making cooperage by hand, but as time goes on, they will add more and more machinery that will more and more mechanize the trade. By the end of the 19th century, when the North family has a very large production of cooperage, in essence, it's an industrialized process being conducted there. So coopering and coopers are ubiquitous in the 19th century. A container, or a farm, like a family farm, would have dozens of containers made by a cooperage. A large communal family, like the Enfield Shaker families, would have hundreds of containers made by a cooper. These will include work containers like buckets, tubs, churns, as well as storage containers for all manner of foodstuffs. As common as cooperage was in the 19th century, very little of it survives today, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that these are work containers. This bucket would be made, it would be used wherever it was going to be used for. When it was no longer serviceable, it would be thrown out. There's no sentimental attachment. These are not family heirlooms. They were made for use and disposed of when they were no longer useful. In addition, as rugged as these containers are, and they are very rugged, they're ethereal or ephemeral by a certain nature of their design and construction, and that is that the hoops are held in place only by friction. Hoops are driven from a narrow diameter towards a wider diameter of the container and stay in place by friction. As the wood changes dimension with the seasons, these hoops will eventually loosen. A user of cooperage in the 19th century would understand that these require constant maintenance. Today we put them down and we store them for very long periods of time. The best advice I can give you if you own a piece of historic cooperage or old cooperage is to carefully store it with the wide end down, so that when the hoops do loosen, they will fall towards the wider part of the container and not entirely off. So when you go to pick it up, especially in the wintertime, be sure that the hoops are snug enough for it to withstand the stress of being picked up. So that's a little bit about cooperage and the trade in the 19th century. Let's go have a look at some photos of cooperage in use at the Enfield Shaker Village.
The first historic image I'd like to share with you is this postcard view of the Great Stone Dwelling. In the lower right-hand corner, we see 2 apple barrels laying on the ground immediately outside the door to the basement where there was cold storage, and they were likely used. A second photo is from the collection of Canterbury Shaker Village. This photo appears in an Enfield album and depicts Enfield's laundry. Stacks of tubs have probably just been cleaned out and have been set upside down to dry. And then the last photo is one of the Kimball Stereo View series. And it's a great picture of 2 boys standing at a well that is immediately outside the East and West Brethren shops, and there's a great tub right there at the base of the well. So now let's discuss the cooperage operations at the different families. We'll begin with the second family, also known as the South family. The second family's cooperage is not as well documented as the other families, and no examples of their work appear in the museum's collection. But a number of visitor accounts describe the cooperage business as being significant, including this one from a visitor from Mount Lebanon in 1850. We went to their machine shop. The brethren work at different kinds of businesses. The greatest branch carried on here is coopering. They expect to make about 4,000 pails and 500 tubs in the coming winter. It is most all done by water power. Returning to the second family photo, this building here behind, with its roof running transverse to some of the other buildings, was a machine shop. We don't know if that's where the cooperage machinery was, but it is a possibility. Turning to the Church family. The Church family cooperage is a little bit better documented. The 1858 history of the Enfield community states, in 1807, the cooper business commenced as a trade for the elders and continued to be one of their occupations till after the decease of elder brother John Beck in 1844. Since but little has been done in the business except to make a few sap buckets. It is now in contemplation to set up the business again and with more and extensive machines. Now it does appear that they, as contemplated, that they set up the business again. This 1873 letterhead that Carolyn Smith recently shared with me indicates that pails are being offered for sale, and clearly the business is continuing. In his book, 15 Years in the Senior Order of the Shakers, Hervey Elkins describes John Beck, or Elder John Beck. Never shall I forget the neatness, the industry, and the economy of that aged father. He arose every morning at the signal of a little alarm clock ever kept in his room, 1 hour before the rest of the family. He built all the kitchen fires, rang the large bell, the signal for general rising. He then resorted to his workshop, a large room in a cream-colored building where he manufactured pails, and commenced his daily labor. How often have I seen him, before breakfast, his white locks floating in the breeze, drawing a light handcart manufactured by himself, containing staves, from the machine shop where he had previously planed and grooved them. The machine shop he mentions is likely the 1812 grist mill, which burns down in 1849, and then was replaced immediately by the stone mill, which still exists today. So we're looking at the location of the grist mill, but not the actual building that was there when Elder John Beck was working in it. The cream-colored building that he describes is likely or possibly the West Brethren shop seen here. There's the well the boys were at in the stereo view we saw earlier. The 1858 history also describes the grist mill and gives a good idea of the machinery available in the Church family mid-century. There were originally 3 run of stone, but afterwards all but 1 were taken out, and the building was mostly occupied as a sort of machine shop. There was a splitting saw, a planing machine, 2 turning lathes for iron, 2 for wood, also machinery for coopering and various other Yankee contrivances. Oh, how I wish they described what those Yankee contrivances were, but this account clearly indicates this progression from a hand process earlier through stages of mechanization that will lead us to the North family cooperage at the end of the century. So that brings us to the North family. The North family was Enfield's novitiate or gathering order. Despite its smaller size and the often transitory nature of its membership, the North family developed into a productive family with a diverse program of trades and agriculture. They were dealt a large blow on Fast Day, April 10, 1856, when a great fire destroyed 11 buildings. Some buildings were rebuilt and others were moved to replace those lost, and the family seemed to recover. But in 1860, after he fled in the night, it was revealed that the North family trustee, Austin Bronson, had allowed debt to accumulate in the amount of $12,000, an overwhelming amount for the small North family. Henry Cummings, a former shaker who wrote prolifically about both the Enfield Shaker community and local history in the paper after he left the Shakers, addresses the North family financial problems in a 1906 article and squarely places the blame on the New Hampshire ministry and the church and North family elders for a lack of oversight. He writes, "The Shakers tried to safeguard this by making trustees accountable to the ministry and elders, but unfortunately, at this time, the ministry were not businessmen and the elder of the family was only a figurehead, so that a slick and cunning rascal like Austin Bronson had matters all his own way. The inventories he furnished were bogus, and the inspection of his accounts and business, which was the duty of the ministry and the elders to exercise, did not amount to shucks." It's tough words from Henry Cummings. The Shakers responded to the plight of the North family by moving William Wilson from the second family over to the North family to take over as trustee. At this time, the cooperage was small but significant part of their overall income. He oversaw the reduction of a considerable amount of the family's debt and was replaced by Henry Cummings as trustee in 1866. Here's a photo of Henry later in life after he left the Shaker village. It was Henry Cummings who would oversee the expansion of the trade and the investment in new machinery to allow dramatic increases in their production. He purchased a steam engine in 1869, and by the mid-1870s, the sale of cooperage and medicinal roots and herbs were by far the largest North family industries. Henry continued to invest in improved machinery for the cooperage, in part because he could make more product with less hired help than it was possible with the medicinal business. By 1877, the debt was eliminated. So let me return to this North family photo, and I'll point out that the North family buildings are this cluster here, and just for reference, the church family structures are in the mid-ground, and in the distance here is the second family. I'd also like to point out this building, which is a dry house made of brick. The North family buildings depicted in this building are all that we had knowledge of, at least photographic evidence of, until this photo shows up. This is part of the Robert H. Levitt collection and was taken by Colonel Frank Churchill. It shows the area, I'm going to blow up this section. It shows the area to the north of the brick dry house and shows us a number of new buildings which we formerly did not have photographic evidence of. The circled building is the cooperage, and we see here a great steam line running from the cooperage where there was a boiler into the root dry house to be used in heating the space to dry the roots. They clearly had burned down one too many dry houses already. There's a great quote in the Western Reserve Historical Society collection of a travel journal of South Union Shakers to the east in 1869. They write on Monday, July 5th, visited the North or gathering order. Their principal business is coopering, making a substantial article of tubs and buckets of pine timber. None of your swiveled up trash. At this point, you might be asking, what is all this machinery we keep hearing so much about? A key information is found in yet another article by Henry Cummings. This one in 1905, talking about shaker technologies and inventions. He writes, coopering or making pails and tubs was begun at an early day, first in a crude way. The staves being split from blocks sawed from logs of old growth pine, of which they owned a very large quantity. They also hooped with wooden hoops. They gradually introduced machinery until at last they used the most modern Winchendon lathes, period. There we go. That's a perfect, concise statement of the move from the hand process of cooperage through incremental increases or changes in machinery to ultimately the North family using what he describes as the most modern Winchendon lathes. That quote was key in allowing us to turn up what were in effect, there were three large manufacturers of cooperage machinery in Winchendon. Despite each one's advertising claims, the three produced products very similar to one another, and the technology did not change dramatically over the last half of the 19th century. This page is from G.N. Goodspeed's catalog, but is typical of all three companies. And I like to point out, you know the saying that carpenters have, be sure you can count to 10 at the end of the day? Well, you better keep that in mind while you're using this machine. Another benefit of seeing these catalog pages is that we were able to identify several artifacts in the collection, objects that had stayed on the site continually since the Shaker era and are a remnant of this production cooperage at either the church or the North family. The first is called a bucket bunk, and it can be seen in detail here as a component of the much larger pail and tub lathe. A second artifact is a component of a rotary matcher. This uses a rotating cutter head to cut the tongue and grooves on the edges of staves. And a third piece of machinery in our collection doesn't have a photo in the Goodspeed catalog. It's in essence obsolete by that time, but the rotary matcher description says it is less difficult to keep in order, does better work, and is fast superseding the slide matcher. And that's what this is, a slide matcher for putting tongue and groove joints on staves. Here's a quick overview of where we're headed. The far table has a selection of Enfield North family sap buckets. The near table has a variety of pails, both lidded and unlidded, from Enfield and Canterbury. Beyond there is Maggie, keeping track of it all. We can't discuss Shaker Cooperage in New Hampshire without mentioning Canterbury. Canterbury also produced buckets for sale. They made, as far as I know, only handled buckets that came both with lids and without lids. Features of Canterbury buckets that are slightly different than Enfield's are a very sharply V-shaped end to the staves with two rivets securing each hoop. These diamond-shaped bail plates, and Canterbury's bail plates are truncated on buckets that had lids, but they're not on buckets without lids. But the key defining feature of Canterbury cooperage is this very steeply pointed V-shaped joint between the staves. That's unique to Canterbury. I know of no other manufacturer of cooperage that uses that exact joint. So you will see some Canterbury containers around, and that's a defining characteristic of a Canterbury bucket. Okay, back to Enfield. We have one church family bucket in our collection, and it is this. Has coffin-shaped bail plates with little ears that stick up above the staves to capture the bail. The reason we know it's church family is because of the initials ND, which stand for Nathaniel Draper, church family trustee,
who actually dies in 1838, but they continue using his initials on products for sale to the world for a long time after his death. This bucket also has a B inscribed in it, and we're not sure what that means or where that's from. But the most important or interesting thing about this bucket is it's the only one in our collection that has a flat joint between the staves, or a butt joint. It is likely quite an early container that was hand joined, and that makes it special in our collection. Okay, now let's move on to some North Family cooperage. Now let's look at some containers made by Enfield's North Family. We'll begin by looking at a few features that will be common on most of these containers, whether it's something like this sap bucket or something like this small handled bucket with a lid. Let's start with the stamp. It's found on the bottom of the bucket, right in the center of the head. It reads NF Shakers, Enfield, New Hampshire. This bucket has a very clear stamp. You may find some buckets where the stamp is very faint and you may need to look in a raking light to find it. But if it's made by the North Family Shakers, it will be there. The next common feature of North Family cooperage is the shape of the tongue and groove between the staves. This is a little bit disorienting. We're looking straight down on the top of a stave. This is the head, and here's a hoop on the side. So this shallow, squared tongue and groove is very common in the North Family cooperage. There will be a couple buckets in very late production that have a sharper squared tongue and groove, but this one's pretty common. The way the ends of the hoops are cut can vary. The most common on North Family production cooperage is a shallow V-shaped cut with the ends of the hoop secured with a single rivet. There are some where the hoop stock will be cut off straight, and I'll point those out as we look at some containers. The North Family made handled buckets in a variety of sizes. Inventories as well as invoices show that there was a numerical series of sizes. We don't have enough information to be able to associate either of these sizes with one of the numbers, but someday we hope we'll be able to see enough of these containers to be able to figure that out. This small container is very interesting in that it's hooped in brass, has a brass bail. It's also very thin and beautifully made, and it's made of cedar. So this is an unusual bucket. We have a list of prices that shows fancy buckets, and I assume that this brass hooped bucket would be one of those fancy buckets. They sold for much more than the regular run-of-the-mill buckets. Enfield lids are typically a metal hoop nailed to a pine top, and we can see because this is split out how it's nailed. There's a lot of variability in how the tops are arranged. This has 2 scribe marks. Diamond-shaped bail plates are common on both of these. The lid on this bucket has a little bit more turning on the top, and the insides of the lids are often surprisingly rough. This shows a lot of marks from an up and down sawmill. This bucket has quite a nice stamp, but I'd like to point out also these 4 marks. These are dog marks. There's a lathe that turned the heads, and these 4 dogs were small protuberances which allowed the lathe to grip the wood so that as it was turned it did not shift. You will see these 4 marks on virtually all the heads of North Family buckets, as well as on the inside of the lids. And there they are here as well. This was chucked twice into the lathe. You can see there's 2 sets of marks very close to each other. Let's quickly look at the bales. The bales on shaker buckets are generally pretty stout. I see some worldly containers with rather thin bale stock, but these are substantial. And the wooden handle
on an Enfield bucket is, this is a very typical design. I'm going to hold this here. Can you see that there's a very slight hollow on either half of the handle, a swell in the middle with a scribe mark at the widest point. So that's pretty typical of a handle on a North family bucket, and there's a little bit of variability. That's generally what we see. Now we arrive at North family sap buckets. There are more sap buckets than any other type of container. You will see sap buckets 99.9% of the time when you find North family cooperage with that stamp, NF Shakers, Enfield, New Hampshire. Remember I mentioned you'd be well served to store your containers upside down? When you store your sap buckets upside down, hang the hanger, this is the hanger, off the edge of the table. Ensure that the staves adjacent to it are still supported by the table. You don't want them to fall right out if the bucket dries up, but now you've got support all the way around and you don't have undue force pressing on the hanger. If you do store them like this and the rest of the bucket loosens, you can force this stave up and out, and that will facilitate the bucket falling apart as well. So here's a good way to store your sap buckets upside down with the hanger hanging off a table or supported somehow. So hangers are one way that many of these buckets differ. I find that this particular bucket is the finest of the Enfield North family productions. A coffin-shaped hanger secured with 2 rivets. And I'll show you the inside of this one so you can see the 2 rivets. This particular style, this long point was driven with force under the top hoop. And you can see here it embedded itself actually into the wood. So when these buckets were made, these hoops were down here. And that gave a 3rd point of contact, 2 rivets and the secured point down there holding this hanger nice and tight. I should point out while we're right here, you will often see this top hoop worked its way up the container. When this container was manufactured, the finish hoops were already on the container when it was painted. This leaves a paint shadow underneath this area that's visible once the hoop moves. But that's okay, that's what you want to see. If this area has been painted, then you know that the bucket has received a layer of paint after the Shakers manufactured it. This color is quite common, this yellow. Red is also a common color for sap buckets that you will see. Now both of these buckets have interiors that appear to have red primer on them. And then there's yellow paint over that red primer. That is very interesting. There's only a very small number of these containers that have that. This bucket has lost most of its paint on the inside, which is very common. It's really rough use on these buckets being used seasonally, soaked with sap, and then allowed to dry out over the rest of the year. I'm going to point out that this transferred from an outside of a bucket it was stored against. Let me get you better light there. So the very faint hint of yellow here is this bucket's original finish. This is paint that stuck on it from the outside of another buck when they were stacked up to be stored over the course of the season. So you'll sometimes see different colored paint stuck on the inside of these containers, and that's not uncommon. So allow me to look, and I hope this shows up. Here's a pretty typical stamp. It can be a little bit hard to see. The stamp is the regular NF Shakers, Enfield, New Hampshire, but below it, on this bucket, there's a 2. And that 2 is a matter of great debate. Rob Emlin has a theory that it indicated second growth pine. Henry Cummings, in an advertisement in the front of one of the manifestos, is advertising second growth pine buckets at a discounted rate, discounted over the premium first growth pine buckets. And that is a theory on why there's a 2 there. There's no 1, there's no 3, and there's only a few of those 2s.
This is virtually identical bucket. Admittedly, a very difficult stamp to see, but there's no 2 on it. So there's one generation of North Family sap buckets. It's a common one to see with the red primer on the inside, and an example of a 2 stamp and not a 2 stamp, both in very similar buckets. The next 2 buckets are generally consistent with the other 2 in their general design. The curve on the top of the staves is similar on both of these. The curve on the edge of the bottom of the stave, this is called the chime, is about the same as the others. Similar hoops, but they differ in their hangers. So here's a hanger with 3 vertically stacked attachment points. The middle one's a rivet, and the upper and lower one are clenched nails. And here's one with 3 attachment points. The top one here is a rivet, and the lower 2 are clenched nails. So the rivet is the more secure attachment method, and the addition of these clenched nails, I think, is a step towards reducing the cost of the container. These are very common. The top curve is the same as the bottom curve. I think they're economically stamped out. This would obviously involve more waste, in that this is not the same as that curve. I find advertisements in popular magazines selling these hangers. Is my suspicion that the Shakers are purchasing them for inclusion on their buckets, although we don't have any concrete evidence to that right now. The next 2 buckets exhibit further changes. First thing to observe is that the top rims are no longer finished with that nice curved surfaces, but they're flat, tapered. In fact, this one is relatively crudely done. We have the same bale hanger we saw a second ago, but this is the first one we've seen with a did I call that a bale hanger? The bucket hanger. This bucket hanger is attached on the inside of the container, and you can see that it's attached with 3 clenched nails. There's no rivet there. Very often, these 3 nails are loose, and you see that over and over and over again. Another change that I like to point out is that the first several buckets had wide hoops on both the head and the upper hoop. And on these, we're getting to the upper hoop having a little bit narrower hoop stock. So another change, which in my opinion is starting to occur over time. One interesting thing about this bucket, it has a whole bunch of very narrow staves and even some knots. It's very possible that this is later in the production era of these containers. The other thing I wanted to point out is this has straight cut-off hoops and a single rivet. So there's another change that's going to occur over time. Again, straight cut-off in here. This one's got reversed hoops. That's not very common. Sometimes you see that one of them has been flipped around, and this possibly may be flipped around, which is why this is offset here. But this is a variant that is known and is often seen on the Enfield buckets, as distinct from the shallow V you saw earlier. The last 2 buckets I'll share with you are a type I had not seen until relatively recently, when several of them were donated to us. First thing I'll point out, it has, again, a coffin-shaped bale or a hanger, but it's very wide, much wider than the one we saw previously. Second thing I'd like to point out is that, if we can see this, the tongue and grooves are slightly different than all the other buckets we've seen, in that they're a little narrower, the sides are steeper, and the tongue is a little taller. They are stamped, so they have the NF Shakers Enfield, New Hampshire stamped. They're slightly larger, both height-wise and in diameter. And
One of them has a number of very small staves, this one, and several with big knots, like right here. So again, there's a suspicion that these are quite late in production. The other difference is there's a great distance between the head, where the head sits into a groove. That groove is called the crows, and again, the bevel at the end of the stave is called the chime. So the head is set very deeply on these. The crows is quite far down, and the chime is almost indiscernible. It is almost not existent. It's just a little bit of a bevel here and there. So their construction's very different. They are very interesting. Somebody charred the inside. I believe that's something people did in the hopes that it would preserve the buckets. It makes your hands dirty. I don't know if it helped with the preservation of the buckets. But these are fascinating. It's an example of, back to the shallow V shape with one rivet as well, and quite wide hoops, both top and bottom. Back to the idea that there's always more to learn. As more of this cooperage comes to light, we will continue to be able to both categorize these, determine where they sit in the timeline of production, and there'll be much more to learn about Enfield's North Family production cooperage.